2 days. That is how long it took. I poured a gallon of this mixture into the deadest corner of my back garden. Clay so compacted I could barely get a trowel into it. And 48 hours later, I pulled back the mulch and counted 31 worms in a single square foot. There had been none. 0. I had checked the week before. Here is what bothers me. This recipe shows up in a USDA soil bulletin from 1948, and then it disappears. Not phased out. Disappeared. The synthetic fertilizer industry was scaling that exact same year. And a soil amendment you can mix in your kitchen for under $2 does not fit on a balance sheet. Stay with me to the end, because I will tell you the one pantry ingredient most people leave out, and it is the ingredient that actually does the work. Let me tell you where this recipe came from, because I want you to understand I am not pulling this off a homesteading blog. I am not a conspiracy person. I am a chemistry teacher. I read documents. A couple of winters ago, I was tracking down a 1943 Victory Garden pamphlet, a separate project I have been pecking at for years, and stapled inside the back of that pamphlet was a mimeographed sheet from a 1948 USDA Soil Conservation Service bulletin. 3 pages, plain language. It described a kitchen mixed soil drench for what the writer called restoring biological activity in compacted home garden soils. The exact formula was right there on page 2. I read it twice, then I went and looked for the same recommendation in the next USDA Extension Bulletin on home soils I could find. 1952. Gone. 1956. Gone. 1960. Gone. I went forward 2 more decades. It never comes back. Not phased out. Not revised. Just disappeared. The way something disappears when nobody decides to keep printing it. The timing is what kept me up. Between 1946 and 1950, the federal government was converting ammonium nitrate plants that had been built for munitions during the war into agricultural fertilizer plants. That is documented. The recommendations changed because the inputs being recommended changed, and here is the stake for you and me. A clay loam home garden, like mine, the kind of compacted Western Carolina soil where you cannot get a trowel in past your knuckle, takes 3 to 5 years to build a real worm population through compost alone. I know because I did that. For 6 seasons I did that. The drench in this bulletin does it in 48 hours and it costs about 40 cents. That is what got stripped out. All right, let us keep going. Here is the recipe, exactly the way I mix it on my back deck. 1 gallon of water. And this part matters more than people realize, so stay with me. The water has to be dechlorinated. Either you let a gallon jug sit uncovered on the counter for 24 hours so the chlorine gas is off, or you use rainwater out of a barrel. Tap water straight from the spigot will not work. I will explain why in a minute. Into that gallon, 2 tablespoons of unsulfured blackstrap molasses. Unsulfured. The sulfured stuff has preservatives that suppress what we are trying to do. 1/4 cup of plain yellow cornmeal. The cheapest bag at the grocery store is fine. And then the ingredient most online versions of this recipe leave out, and the one I will come back to at the end of this video. 1 tablespoon of dry powdered milk. Non-fat dry milk, the kind that comes in a box. That is it. Stir it until the molasses dissolves. Cost breakdown. Molasses runs about 30 cents per application, cornmeal about 15 cents, dry milk about 40 cents, water free if it is rainwater. Under $1 per gallon, call it 85 cents. Application is just as important as the mix. You pour it slowly across roughly 1 square yard of soil. Slowly, not in a stream. You want it to soak in, not run off. Then you put the mulch back over the top. And the mulch is not optional. I will get to that. And you do not water on top of it for 48 hours. You leave it alone. For a full payoff, I peel back the mulch at the 48-hour mark, get down on my knees with a jeweler's loop. I keep a 10-power loop in the garage for leaf work, and it is perfect for this. And I count. You will not find this recipe in any current extension publication. I have looked. The closest thing modern soil science gives you is a generic recommendation to add organic matter. That is true. And it is also useless if you need results this season. Now here is the part that surprised me when I worked it out, because the recipe by itself is not the interesting thing. The mechanism is the interesting thing. Worms do not eat cornmeal. Worms do not eat molasses. If you put a teaspoon of molasses on top of bare soil, a worm will not crawl over and drink it. That is not how they feed. Worms eat soil and organic matter that has been colonized by bacteria. And what they are actually digesting is the bacterial biofilm, the slime layer the bacteria leave behind on every soil particle they touch. The bacteria are the food, the soil is the plate. So, what this drench is doing is not feeding worms, it is feeding the bacteria the worms feed on. The molasses is a simple sugar carbon source. As soon as it hits moist soil at the right temperature, the resident bacterial population, and there are always some bacteria, even in dead looking compacted clay, explodes. 18 to 30 hours. Population doubles every 20 minutes under good conditions. By the end of the first day, you have a bacterial bloom thick enough to see as a faint haze if you put a clod under magnification. The cornmeal is the slow release piece. It is a complex carbohydrate that takes longer for the bacteria to break down. So, as the molasses sugars run out around day 2, the cornmeal carries the bloom forward into day 3, day 4, day 5. That sustained bloom is what gives the worms time to migrate in from the surrounding soil. And they will migrate sometimes from a couple of feet away because they detect bacterial biofilms chemically. The microbiology is taught in every soil Science 101 class. The application is not. The way I put it to myself and the way I put it to my AP chemistry students for 30 years when we talked about anything like this, you are not feeding the worms. You are setting a table. All right, let me show you the numbers because I do not want you taking my word for this. I ran the comparison. Fall of 2023, I marked off 3 1 square yard plots in the deadest corner of the back garden. The corner closest to the ravine, where the clay is worst and where I had been losing tomatoes for 2 years to compaction. I baseline counted all 3 the week before, peeling back the existing mulch, square foot by square foot with the loop. 0 worms, 0 worms, 0 worms. Wrote it in the notebook. Plot A, I left alone, control. Plot B, I poured a gallon of plain dechlorinated water across. Same volume, same application speed, same mulch replacement. I needed to know whether the water itself was doing anything. Plot C, I gave the full drench. 48 hours later, on my knees, mulch peeled back, loop in hand. Plot A, 0. Plot B, 1 worm, 1. So the water alone did almost nothing. Basically a rounding error. Plot C, 31 worms in 1 square foot, 19 and 24 in the 2 adjacent squares. That is the number I gave you at the top, 31. Same corner where the week before there had been none. The next spring I ran it again, the deadest stretch of my test bed near the deck. And if you have watched any of my videos, you have heard me mention the test bed. It is the 4x8 plot I keep for side-by-side comparisons exactly like this. Same recipe, same 48-hour window. 28, 31, 34 worms in the 3 squares I counted. Same range, repeatable. I ran the comparison 3 times. The records do not lie. Now, before I tell you about the bonus ingredient, and I will, I promised I would, that is coming. There is a 4th layer here that I want you to have because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets stripped out when a recommendation has to fit on a fertilizer bag label. There are 4 conditions, and if you miss any one of them, the drench does nothing. Not less. Nothing. First, soil temperature has to be above 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Below that, the bacterial bloom stalls. The bacteria are still there. They just are not multiplying fast enough to feed a worm response in 2 days. I check soil temp before every application with a digital soil thermometer. It is the same thermometer I use for spring planting decisions, and it lives in the garage with the notebook. If the soil is 52 degrees, I wait a week. There is no point. Second, dechlorinated water. I mentioned this, and I'm coming back to it. Municipal tap water in most of the country runs 1 to 4 parts per million of chlorine. Sometimes chloramine, which is worse because it does not gas off the way chlorine does. That is enough to kill the resident bacterial seed population in the top inch of soil. You will pour the drench, you will feed a sterile patch, and nothing will happen. Either let your tap water sit 24 hours uncovered or use rainwater. Third, the ratio matters. 4 parts cornmeal to 1 part molasses by volume. DT. That is what the 1/4 cup and the 2 tablespoons works out to. If you go heavier on the molasses, you get a sugar spike that crashes by hour 20. The bloom collapses and the worms do not have time to find it. If you go lighter, the bloom never gets above background. I tested both ends. 4-to-1 is the floor, fourth mulch cover. Non-negotiable. Bare soil will dry the top inch out in 6 to 8 hours on a warm afternoon. A dried bacterial bloom is a dead bacterial bloom. 2 inches of any organic mulch, wood chips, straw, shredded leaves, keeps the moisture and the temperature stable through the 48-hour window. I have tested it without mulch. The worm count drops to 4 or 5. Same recipe, same plot, just no blanket. Those 4 conditions are exactly the kind of detail that gets stripped out when a recommendation has to fit on a fertilizer bag label. You cannot put soil temperature thresholds and dechlorination protocols on the back of a bag. So when the extension publication shifted in the early 50s toward recommendations that could be packaged and sold, this whole framework, the temperature, the water, the ratio, the cover, went with it. The chemistry teacher in me finds that genuinely interesting. The gardener in me finds it expensive. Now, before we keep going, I want to share something with you. If what I am walking you through here is making sense, if you are starting to see how much of yield is a measurement problem rather than a luck problem, I wrote the whole system down. It is called Steve's 30-Day Maximum Yield Protocol, $17 at stevesgardenbooks.com. Chapter 3 is the Soil Reset chapter. That is where the microbiology, the pH targets, the amendment rates, and the soil thermometer rules all sit together, along with 2 diagrams, a pH and nutrient availability chart, and a compost layering cross-section. This is the chapter built for people who are past the will anything grow stage and into how do I get more from what I'm already doing. If you are watching on your television, grab your phone and point it at the QR code on screen. If you're on a phone or laptop already, the link is in the description. Take your time pulling that up. I will be right here. All right, let us keep going, because the more interesting question is why the framework disappeared in the first place. Here is the part I sat with for a while before I was comfortable saying it out loud. Between 1946 and 1950, the United States had an enormous amount of ammonium nitrate manufacturing capacity that had been built during the war to make munitions. Those plants did not get shut down. They got redirected. Ammonium nitrate is a nitrogen fertilizer. So almost overnight, the country went from making explosives to making bagged synthetic nitrogen, and there was a massive supply looking for a market. The market that absorbed it was American agriculture, and the channel that delivered the recommendations was the USDA extension system working through the land-grant universities. Through the 50s and 60s, more and more extension publications were co-developed alongside industry partnerships. The recommendations standardized around NPK numbers on a bag. That is not a conspiracy. That is a documented funding shift you can read about in any history of agricultural science. The result, though, was that biological soil amendments, anything where the active ingredient was alive and variable, quietly fell off the publication list. You cannot print a guaranteed analysis for live bacteria on a paper label. I want to be honest with you about the counter-argument. Synthetic NPK genuinely did raise commodity scale yields. For 1,000 acres of corn, the math worked. I am not going to sit here and pretend that did not happen. But the home gardener got sold the same paradigm. Buy the bag. Follow the rate. And the home gardener is the one person who has access to something a 1,000-acre operation does not. A kitchen, time, and a square yard you can actually watch. I lived inside that paradigm for 6 years. From 2004 to about 2010, I bought bagged amendments. Garden number 1, 12 tomatoes off 6 plants. I was feeding the bag's instructions, not the soil. It took me until I started reading the older bulletins to realize the framework I needed had already existed and been set aside. It was not buried because it was wrong. It was buried because it was free. All right, the pantry ingredient I told you to stay for, the one that actually does the work, it is dry powdered milk. Non-fat dry milk, the kind that has been sitting in the back of pantries for 50 years. Here is the mechanism. Lactose is the simple sugar in milk. Lactobacillus and a handful of related soil bacteria multiply on lactose explosively in 24 to 36 hours, faster than they multiply on molasses alone. Casein, the protein in milk, breaks down slowly and releases nitrogen and calcium right into the same bloom. so the bacteria bloom harder, last longer, and coat more soil particles. That biofilm, the slime layer the bacteria leave behind, is what worms actually eat. I ran the comparison in the test bed. Molasses and cornmeal only, no milk, 6 to 8 worms per square foot at the 48-hour check. Full recipe with the tablespoon of dry milk, 28 to 34. Same plot, same week. Adjacent squares. The milk is the multiplier. The ingredient costs about 40 cents per application. The reason most of the online versions of this recipe leave it out is simple. Powdered milk does not look like a soil amendment. It looks like something you put in coffee. Every time someone copied the recipe after the 1948 bulletin disappeared, the unfamiliar-looking ingredient got dropped, and the version that survived online is the weaker one. The ingredient that does the work is the one most people leave out because it does not look like fertilizer. I spent $12 on a bag of granular fertilizer in 2004. I would have gotten further with 40 cents of powdered milk. All right, before I let you go, you have the recipe now. You have the missing ingredient. If you want the system that lets you measure whether it actually worked in your own soil, because counting 31 worms only matters if you also counted the 0 from the week before, that is Chapter 2 of Steve's 30-day maximum yield protocol. The Measurement Foundation, 115 pages total with 2 diagrams in that chapter alone. The record-keeping template and the measurement points on a plant. 22 years of my own notebooks sit behind that chapter. stevesgardenbooks.com. Link in the description. If you're on the big screen, scan the QR code now. Go ahead and grab your phone if you need to. No rush. I will hold right here for a second. So that is the recipe. 1 gallon of dechlorinated water, 2 tablespoons of unsulfured blackstrap molasses, a quarter cup of cornmeal, and the tablespoon of dry powdered milk that the post-1948 extension literature quietly forgot to keep. You can test it yourself in 1 square yard this weekend for less than $1, and you will know in 48 hours whether your soil is dead or just hungry. The next one I'm already working on is that 1943 tomato pamphlet I mentioned earlier, and a Depression-era trick I tested for 2 full seasons against modern best practice, and the older method outperformed. All right, that is what I have for you today. I will see you in the next one.